Hello everyone, so today I'm going to talk about workflow with Sitecore. This is going to be a very basic introduction to that topic. I'm going to show how to create those items and then how to add it to this article item that I have already running in this example 8.2 Sitecore instance. So let's get started. So the first thing is you're going to find these settings inside the content editor. So we'll go into the content editor. I've been logged out, so I'll just log myself back in. And now we'll find those workflow items I was speaking of inside the tree. So to find that is we'll go inside System, and then there's this area called Workflows. You'll see that there's already a bunch of workflows in here. One is a sample workflow, which is good in addition to what I'm going to show you is you're going to find this workflow in all your own Sitecore instances when you freshly install a Sitecore instance. But you'll also see a bunch of other ones. These are used for some of the marketing things require or have workflow enabled so that you have to kind of go through a step process before you publish those items. Which brings me to a good point. What is workflow? So if you don't have workflow enabled, anybody has permissions to edit a piece of content, such an article or even just the home page item, whatever items that are inside your content tree. They can do that. They can make changes to these items, and then at that point, once they're done with that item, they can publish those items directly to production. Whereas most organizations have some sort of workflow process of, okay, a content editor should not have access to publish content directly, for example. So if you have a content manager, they might be able to actually go ahead and publish content. So a content editor in a typical organization, you'd want to have some sort of setup where a content editor goes in, edits some content, says it looks good, and then kind of says, okay, pass it off to the content manager, which will review my work and approve it or reject it. If they approve it, then that's some systems can be set up to automatically publish that content at that point. Or if you reject that, you can send it back to the content editor. It shows up in their workbox, which I'll show quickly here today, and allows them to edit whatever changes were commented in by the content manager. So that's kind of a typical flow in my opinion. There are other flows. Some organizations might have several layers. So you wouldn't necessarily have a content editor or a content manager. You'd have a content editor, then some sort of legal team looks at it, SEO team, marketing, whatever that would be. And then maybe some sort of high level project manager would look at the content as the last stage. So you might have 4 or 5 stages. I will say this, if you add a lot of workflow steps, you're going to find that you're going to want to break that at some point. So too many levels can become cumbersome, and there might be somebody in the middle tier that goes on vacation, for example, and you need to get something published right away, and it kind of breaks down at that point. So I would say stay away from large workflow processes, especially with your website. You can always backtrack and go through the legal, etc., through the content manager, who only would be one step. They can review it. They can go to the legal team and review it with them manually, versus having some sort of large workflow state process set up for your website that requires all these different people to review it and get it to production. So that's just one note to point out. All right, so let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to create a new workflow folder or item. And I typically would want to make this more descriptive. One thing I will note is you could have different workflows for different types of items as well. So one of a common type of workflow I see a lot is with comments. So you could have a submitted workflow state for comments that have just been submitted. Then you can mark them as spam, mark them as rejected, etc. until they're approved for that. So that's one type of content that you would want a specific type of workflow for. You could have some sort of news section or press release, which might go through a whole different team if you're a large organization, and that workflow would be different than maybe the workflow for the basic pages on your site. So give it a descriptive name. I'm going to give it just a name of content workflow, which is very broad and not too descriptive. So, but I'm going to assign this to pretty much all content, or at least that's what would be my intent with this. And like I said, it's going to be a very basic workflow, a very standard workflow that you'd want to use. So content workflow. And now I'm going to start defining some of the states that go inside this workflow item. So our system is going to have 3 states. It's going to be a draft state, which is basically means this content is being edited currently. So anything in that draft state, any language or any version of an item that's in a content workflow draft state means that it's not in production. And you're going to see that you get errors if something is in the draft workflow state, or even if it's not in the awaiting approval state, which I'll show how to configure that here in a second. So I'm going to just start creating these states. So the first one is draft, like I said. So I have the draft state, and you can write a little description about it. You can set preview publishing targets. That's just the targets that you set as previews, and you can set if this state is final or not, which I'll show what that means in a second once I get to a state that is the final. The next state is a awaiting approval state. Basically, when a content editor makes changes to a piece of content, once they're ready to let a content manager or somebody at an elevated permission state see that and approve that, it goes into an awaiting approval state, or that's at least what we're calling it. You can call it whatever fits your organization's naming conventions, but so I'll just call it awaiting approval. And then lastly, I will create what I consider the final workflow state. So it's gone from the draft state, now somebody's got to approve it in the awaiting approval state, and if somebody approves it and says it's ready for production, it's going to go into what I consider a final workflow state, which is just approved. You could also call this published, because technically anything in this last state is published, especially if you enable any automatic actions to trigger a publish on when something is approved. From when they click that approved command, it triggers an automatic publish. It would automatically get published. So now that we have the approved state, we can click final, meaning it's the final state. Also, another thing that we should do now is we go back to the main workflow folder. We should specify what the initial state is. So by default, this is the state that every item would be in. So we're going to select the draft state. And that's pretty much it. Now you have workflow, although now it's hard for, really this is where new roles would come in. So you would want to have users that are able to edit content that's in approved or waiting approval or draft. Like I said, you're going to have a content editor and a content manager in this scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and just create those users real quick before I go into any more of workflow and assigning it to items. So if I go back to security and I go into user manager, I think it is. I'm basically trying to get to the role manager. So if I click on role manager, I'm just going to go ahead and create 2 new roles. I'm going to call one a content editor. So you can see I got a content editor there. And now I'll create a content manager. So now that we've created a content manager and content editor roles, we'll need to assign roles to those. So adding roles to an existing role allows you to create a chain of inheritance for roles, as well as give additional permissions to a content editor or content manager, etc. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add the Sitecore client authoring, which is basically the very basic permissions to the content editor. We're also going to do the same to the content manager as well. So we're just going to select client authoring, as well as I'd like to also give them the ability to publish. So I'll select that one. And now we're done. So the next thing is we're going to create users that inherit these roles or implement these roles. So if we go over to the users and we click on new, I'm going to create a user called CE just to represent the content editor. And I'm not going to give them an email, and I'm just going to give them a basic password. And now I will select content editor, click OK. And you'll see that what it's done is it's noticed what roles were assigned to the content editor role and assigned, and now it's showing those as additional kind of children of the content editor. So Sitecore client authoring actually inherits roles and permissions from Sitecore client users as well. So it says I have to. Let's just all right, and I'll just create another one called CM Content Manager. CM. All right. And now I will assign them to the content manager role. And you'll see now that you're seeing additional options. So the kind of a child role of Sitecore Client Advanced Publishing is the Sitecore Client Publishing. And like before, they were already assigned to Sitecore Client Users was assigned to Content Manager. So now you get these other roles pulled in. So it's basically building a hierarchy of roles, and they're being assigned just by assigning the Content Manager role to this user. We're getting all these other roles that are coming in because of the chain of roles that have been assigned from one role to the other. So I'll click next and close. So now we have two users. They represent two different levels of content editor and content manager, and they will now be assigned to here in a second to the workflow states. So I'm just going to back out of this. And now the next thing I want to show is the states or the command actions that you can add to each of these workflow states. So the first one is draft. So really the only command that we want to add or give to this state is the ability to send something to the awaiting approval state. So if we right click on the draft state and click insert, we can click on command. And we should give it an appropriate name here. So in the draft state, we're just going to say request approval. So by clicking this command, what it's going to do is give you options of which command or which states, clicking this command, what states it sends this workflow item or the item into. So we're going to say the next state for this is the awaiting approval state. There's an option to suppress comments. This is an option when you send something from one workflow state to another, you can get an option to type in comments about that. So example, if you're in a draft state and you're sending something into the awaiting approval state, you might put this content is completed, it includes blah blah blah, and things like that. So there are also some other options here. You can express or add an appearance evaluator type. So if you wanted to hide the request approval. An example of this is in the awaiting approval state, there would be an approved state. If we wanted to reject that approved state from showing up for somebody that has written an article and sent it, like for example, a content manager maybe has written an article in the draft state, sent it to request approval, and now has it showing up in their box as an option that they can just approve it. Well, we wouldn't necessarily want one person to be able to take a piece of content, get it all the way into production without it being reviewed by somebody else. So appearance evaluator type might be just some custom logic that just says, oh, your current user, your user account matches the user who created this piece of content. So reject that from showing up for you because you shouldn't be able to approve something that you wrote. And dialogue height, you can customize how large the dialogue is for comments. So that's pretty basic. So let's go ahead and create a few other commands here. So for the awaiting approval, we'll create another command called, after I save that one, I'll call this approved. And I will just say the next workflow state is approved. And I will create one called reject. And this will send the content back to the draft state. And we could suppress the comments on the approved state because it's not necessarily something that somebody would see again. But on the reject state, we would probably want to write some sort of comment about why it was rejected. Another thing I like to do is just change the icon. So the approves all or the request approvals, they're all pretty much okay symbols to use, but you might want to just show like a red X or something for the rejected state. And these will show up in the review tab when you start working with these pieces of content. You start trying to, you click on these options to approve, reject, etc. They'll show up in the reviews tab and give you kind of show these icons. So it'll be kind of representative. Another thing I mentioned before was the ability to create some sort of action for a command. So once a command's run, you can trigger some sort of other type of action. So you could trigger all types of different actions. You could say trigger some sort of publish. You could say send off some sort of complex email, things like that. So I'm not going to go into that for this session, but there is the ability to send out emails. There's ability to automatically publish items, things like that. So I'm going to cover that in a later session. So once things go into approved, it's ready to be published, and at that point, things can be published. So now that we've set up all of this, the next part I really want to show you is how to add workflow to an item. So we're going to go into our example templates folder and find the article item. So I'm going to add workflow to the article. So an article will now be able to go through some sort of workflow. So only a content editor can edit it, and a content manager could also theoretically create a version of an item, make changes to it, and then request approval. Then it would go to a content manager to review that piece of content and mark it as approved, and then it would be able to be published on the site. So to do this, I'm going to click on the standard values, and I'm going to scroll down to the workflow tab or section. And I'm going to then set the workflow to content workflow. And I'm going to set default workflow to content workflow as well. And that is it. All we need is those two options selected, and then the state will actually automatically get populated when you add a new item. So what am I going to go ahead and do is go up to content error, and I'm going to actually add something that is going to use workflow. So I will create a new version item or item of article, and I'll just call it test. And now you'll see that this item is in the draft workflow state. and it's assigned to the content workflows that I selected. Some other things to note is now that it's in a specific workflow state, it says that if you publish now, the selected version will not be visible on the website because it's not in the final workflow state. Basically saying this is in a draft state, and because of that, it will not be published. It can only be published when it reaches that approved or final workflow state. So that's the power of workflow, because now you can start creating not only creating new items that have workflow, but you can actually create new language or new versions of existing items, and they will be applied to workflow. For example, article new, I could go and say versions and just create a new version. And now you see that it says the older version will be basically published and not this current version, because we're working with version 2. So version 1 is approved. It's actually not even in workflow. It's an item that's not currently added to a workflow state or anything like that. But the new item any new items that we create, or new versions of items that we create, they will be applied and added to workflow. So this is saying that version 1 will be published instead, not this current item or version. And you'll see that this is set to the draft state. So if we go over to version 1, you'll see that it doesn't have a state assigned to it. So I'm not going to cover how to do this or add existing items to workflow that were added before workflow was implemented in this tutorial, but I will say that it's a really good idea to set up workflow early on. If you're going to add it, it's a good idea to add it early. There are ways with PowerShell, Sitecore PowerShell, and things like that to automatically add workflow to other items that don't already have it, especially when you're adding workflow later on. But that's out of the scope of this tutorial. So we've created workflow. We've created 2 items that have it. So what I'm going to do next is just kind of quickly brush into permissions and reviews of items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the roles, or back to the security manager, basically. I want to actually go to the security editor. So what I want to do is give some permissions to those roles that were originally created, the content and the content manager. So if I go to the content workflow, I'm actually going to add some states here. Let me open up columns, and I want to see workflow state write, state delete, and workflow command execute. Really, the important one is this command execute. We will now be able to apply permissions directly to a workflow command execute, which is when you would see the ability to see those commands show up for a specific role. So right now I'm working with the default anonymous user, but I actually want to switch to the content manager. Now I'm working with the content manager, and now I will go find the workflows item, content edit workflow, and I will work with the draft and awaiting approval state. So request approval, I'm going to go ahead and assign the ability for the content manager to see this as well as these 2 options. And then I'm going to update or pull in the content editor as well. And I'm just going to assign him to only be able to see command execute. I'm also going to give him workflow state write, and I'm going to go back to the content manager and give him permissions to write as well. So I've set the roles here. I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm going to cover this in a future tutorial on how to configure this and some other settings and things that you need to know about when working with the security editor. But for now, I'm just trying to get it set up so that we can start logging in as those new users. I'm also going to give some permissions to some of the content inside the tree. So inside here, I want to give everybody read, write, access, and create for this and everything below it. So if I double click, I can say inheritance. So it's basically going to apply everything below this item. And I'll do the same with the content editor as well. So read, create, and write. And you can double click, and then you can say, and just like that, you should be able to now make changes to these items when you log in. So as well as another thing I need to give it access to is if we go back to workflow, content editor, draft, we need to give it access to make changes to this this state. So what I can do is I can click on workflow state right, and I won't give the content editor access to awaiting approval. Then I'll click on content manager, and I will give them access to both of these, awaiting approval and draft state. So that's it. Now we'll log in as a content editor real quick. So I will log in as the CE user. As you can see, they have a very basic interface. If I click on content editor, I can now go into this. One thing they cannot see is what's in the bucket. There's a way to enable that, but I won't cover that today. You'll see that I also can't enable it because the options, the tab that gives you options, the view tab, isn't available. So now I'll create a new article under blog. I'll click OK. And it's basically telling me if you publish now, this item, you will not be able to see it. So basically it's saying that you have a workflow, that this item is workflow. So I can make some changes to the content. Don't mind my mistyping there, it doesn't really matter. And just some other items in here. So I'll save. And now I want to move this item to awaiting approval state. So for the contenter, what he can do is he can go over to this reviews tab. And now you'll see that he has a couple of options underneath this workflow chunk. So the first one is a history. You can click on history. This kind of shows you the kind of path that this item has taken. Right now, because we just created it, it's saying change from question mark to draft, meaning basically it was just created. It also, the comment is item created. There's no real user comments yet. So not much, a whole lot going on there. So another option is to check in. So when you're making changes to this content, it's going to check it out as you, especially as you get into a multi-user, Sitecore instance. So I'm just going to check this in. So now it's set to saying it's locked, and you must click this lock and edit button to unlock it so that you can make changes to it. You'll also notice that the request approval button has been disabled just because you don't have access rights to this piece of content. So I'll go ahead and click edit, and now I can make changes to it again. Also, you are seeing different versions, or you can see versions of this item. There's only one version currently. So if you wanted to switch versions or you wanted to create a whole new version of this item, you could do that as a content editor. So now what we want to do is just request approval. So we're going to take this piece of content, send it up to the content manager for them to approve or reject. So does this look good? And now basically what's happened is the item is in the awaiting approval state in the content workflow. I was probably a little redundant naming there, but anyways, also another thing that you can see is you cannot edit this item because you do not have right access to it. Basically, it's gone outside your workflow state, so you cannot make changes to it anymore. You could theoretically create new versions of this item. I don't have the permissions configured to allow you to do that. So you would, when you go to in here to make changes to it, you would end up just creating another version, not working with version 1. You'd be working with version 2. That's where things can get a little crazy for a content editor and content manager when you're working with lots of items. If you don't pay attention to what version you're working on, you could end up with 10 different versions of the item because you keep making changes to it, but you're not making changes to the version that you want to make changes to. There is a tool called Xcentium that allows you to, every time you make changes to anything, it kind of logs a version of that item. I would like to cover that in the future to just showcase that tool and how that works. Actually, it's built by Xcentium. It's called Vault. I just remember the name right off the top of my head. So let's go ahead and log out and just see what the interface looks like for a content manager. Same basic interface. I'll click on Content Editor. And now I'm going to show the workbox. The workbox is an interface that allows you to see what items are waiting for you in your workflow state. So for a content manager, they're technically part of 2 workflow states, so they would see stuff that's in the draft state as well as the awaiting approval state. But yeah, so and the content editor would only see stuff that's waiting for their approval or their actions to take place that are in the draft state. So there's a lot of different ways to get to the workbox. One is right here on the launch pad. I just showed you the other one on the content editor. There's a world workbox here. So we'll just click that real quick. The next thing that you need to do to get things to start showing up is you got to select which workflow to show stuff from. So we're just going to select the content workflow. And now you'll see that it's showing you a lot of different things. So it's showing you the things that are awaiting approval. Like I said, since I'm a content manager, it's going to show me this one, as well as it's going to show you stuff that's in the draft state. So these are things that I created. I actually created most of these while I was in the as a super user or the administrator, but you can also see them because they are in those workflow states. So now we can work with this awaiting approval item. There's a lot of things we can do. We can actually click on the item and it will take us to the item, or take us to it in a kind of another window. So now we can make changes to this. We'd obviously have to lock and edit this item, and it will allow us to make changes to it. And we're only making changes to this version of this item. So if I press Control S, then it will allow me to do that. I can go ahead and just check this in, and now it's still in this workflow state because I've checked it in only. Just checking in as a single user checking in, not initiating any of these special commands. Other options, you can actually click this and say approve selected. You can do approved all, reject selected, reject all. Basically, these are pulling the commands that we specified. So if you had 5 different commands here, you might have a lot of different buttons here to approve selected or reject selected, or for example, request approval from selected. Basically, those were the commands for the draft state. You can do differences on these. This wouldn't make sense for this item, but you could do a diff that would show you a little bit more. This shows you a little bit about the history that we showed before. So you can see it went from this on Sunday, July 9th, and then on a little while later, he sent it from changed from draft to awaiting approval and says, does this look good? So and this CE user is representing the specific user. It's not the role, but the user itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on this, and I'm just going to lock and edit it, and I'm going to take it to the reviews tab, and I'm just going to go ahead and reject it for now. So I'm just going to say no, this doesn't look good. And so now this has gone, and now it's sitting again in draft state. And we can see that by clicking the refresh. Now we can see that we have 3 items in the draft state. So we can actually get a little bit more detail. It shows the last changed. So it shows these 2 items are new, and this is the one we just changed from awaiting approval to draft. And it shows the comment that we specified. So a lot of good information here to kind of help work with the items that are in these states. So now what I want to do is I want to send this back up just to show the options that are available. So if I click edit, so I'll click a request approval and I'll just say, okay, now this looks good. And now it's gone into the awaiting approval state again. So lastly, what I want to do is I want to just send this off to the approved state, which will send it into the final approved workflow state, and it should at that point be publishable. So if I go on review, click edit, and I click approved, I suppress the comments on this one. So now it says I can't edit it. That's because I've just changed the permissions for, I don't think I enabled it to give me permissions on the approved state for this user. This is how you would add additional workflow or additional versions to an item. It has to give you access to that approved state. Anyway, so lastly is I'll just show publishing. This is nothing new, but since I gave this user the ability to publish everything, we just can go publish site or this role. Oh, I keep saying the wrong words. Well, that's actually one issue. So I needed to give the CM the permissions to specific publishing targets, but I won't show that here today. But we'll go back to my administrator user, and we will go into content editor, and we'll just find that item that we created that's in a different, that has version 1. You'll notice that the strip is gone, not saying that it's in the wrong workflow state. If we scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that it's in the approved state. So that's pretty much it. This concludes this tutorial. I hope that you learned a little bit about workflow. I definitely think that you should set this up initially in your setups, just a very basic one if need be. We just showed you setting up for an article, but it really would make sense for a lot of the content in your tree. You might, like I said, have workflow that's different based off the types of content you have. So you might have a basic workflow for your home and your blog and your basic pages, whereas the articles that you create might be a different team inside your enterprise, and you might have a different workflow state for that. So I'm going to cover more topics on workflow and setting up roles and things like that in the future. Some of the custom commands and custom actions I'm going to cover here in the future. So let me know if you have any questions or comments based around workflow. I'll probably show a more advanced workflow in the future as well. But that's it. Thank you.